Everyone is familiar with the Ape Woman, the living skeleton, or Betty MacGregor, a.k.a. Stella the Bearded Lady. But they were not the only examples of what they call circus freaks. This list is a compilation of the weirdest and lesser-known freaks who deserve the same level of respect and recognition, but often get buried beneath the bigger names. Ready to see something rare? Well, let's dive in. Number 15. Fakir Musafar. Roland Loomis was an ordinary man until he decided not to be. In his late 40s, he dropped the life script and transformed into Fakir Musafar. He wasn't trying to shock anyone. He turned body modification into ritual, piercing skin, hanging from hooks, bleeding by choice. He didn't fake pain. He leaned into it. Tribal ceremonies, flesh suspensions, cultural rites. He studied them, practiced them, and lived them. For Fakir, the body wasn't just skin and nerves. It was a doorway. In 1977, he started performing publicly, showing what the human body could handle when the mind let go. Most people didn't understand it, and he didn't need them to. He knew exactly what he was doing. His work still influences piercing culture, tattoo artists, and spiritual circles around the world. There was no applause needed. Fakir didn't want to entertain. He wanted to break limits. He believed pain could mean something and made that belief into a legacy. Number 14. The Frog Boy. Carl Norwood lived with a form of dwarfism that twisted and shortened his limbs, yet he made the stage his living, not his prison. He was billed as the Frog Boy and sometimes the Frog Man, and he took the same circuit as Dick Hilburn, the Quarter Man, rolling into small towns and fairgrounds with their modest, rough-edged act. After Hilburn's death in 1971, Carl stayed with Hilburn's widow before moving on to Ward Hall's show. He kept touring until his own health gave out. "I never asked for applause," he reportedly told a friend. "Just a fair wage." He died in Atlanta at only 37. Carl never made the headlines, but within the tight-knit sideshow world, he was respected, punctual, disciplined, and careful with his money. His body looked fragile or may not be normal, but his work ethic never was. Carl turned the cruel spectacle of his form into steady labor and dignity, an everyday defiance that never needed a flashy spotlight. Number 13. The French Giant. Jean Behin was born in Belgium in 1805 and grew into a man who couldn't slip quietly through a crowd even if he tried. His height was a mystery. Some claimed nearly 7 feet, others said 8, but his presence was bigger than any number. He sang, acted, cracked jokes, lifted heavy things, and sold out theaters across Europe. When he crossed the Atlantic, Barnum knew what he had: a crowd magnet. But ego travels too. Behin clashed with Colonel Goshen, another tall performer, and their backstage fight became a front-stage payday after Barnum promoted the rematch. Behin played characters, backed the Union during the war, and never stopped moving. But he wasn't all charm. His marriage ended in scandal, and during his feud with Goshen, he was accused of racist slurs. He died in 1873, buried in Brooklyn. People remember his size, but they forget the storm behind it. Gene wasn't just tall, he was complicated, flawed, and hard to miss. Number 12. The Mule-Faced Woman. Grace McDaniels lived her entire life with a facial deformity so pronounced it drew gasps before words. Promoters billed her as the Mule-Faced Woman and the ugliest woman in the world, twisting her suffering into a brand. Her features were heavily distorted, but her demeanor was soft, almost shy. She married, raised a son, and kept working in the tents while strangers pointed. "I don't need their kindness," she once told a reporter. "I just need them to pay." Her son did not inherit her condition, but slid into drinking, petty crime, and public embarrassment. His name, not hers, became a scandal. Grace stayed steady, a professional to the end, performing until her death in 1958. Within the sideshow community, She was respected for her endurance and dignity. Her life is a stark reminder that the crowd's judgment rarely matches the person inside. Grace withstood a lifetime of ridicule with a composure that outlasted the stares. Number 11. The Alligator Girl. Esther Parnell came into the world in 1926 in Kenley with ichthyosis, a very rare condition that cracked and thickened her skin into a pattern that strangers compared to scales. Alongside her brother Bill, who shared the same disorder, she stood under hot lights in Joe Hilton's Sideshow during the 1940s as one half of the Alligator Twins. Crowds stared, but Esther turned spectacle into income. In 1947, she married musician Thomas Blackman and started traveling on her own terms. "If they're going to look, let them pay for it," she once said. She had her first child a year later, billing herself as the world's strangest mother, and went on to raise 7. Esther performed up until 1982, even stepping briefly into cinema with appearances in The Mutations and The Sentinel, where her act became part of the horror. In the end, she died in 2003. People remembered her not as a curiosity, but as a woman who did what was simply impossible. Number 10. The Octoman. Rudy wasn't just born different, he carried someone else's unfinished body with him. A parasitic twin fused into his torso left him with extra limbs, an extra head, and even an extra ear buried in tangled hair. One of his own legs never worked right, so he leaned on crutches, shifting through life with the weight of another person half attached to him. In the 1970s and 80s, they called him Octoman in circus posters, like it were some marvel. But behind the curtain, Rudy lived in silence. Doctors offered surgery in 2008, a chance to be normal, but he said no. That's because poverty played a role, but so did something deeper. The body he'd carried was all he knew. He disappeared from the spotlight in the late 80s and stayed out of sight until he died in 2023. He died from a stroke, in solitude, not spectacle. His body made headlines, but not his life. Number 9. Le Bossu. Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame might not have sprung entirely from imagination. In 19th century Paris, inside the cathedral Hugo wrote about, a hunchbacked stone carver quietly worked on restoration projects. British researcher Tony Hargreaves unearthed a memoir that mentions him simply as Le Bossu, the hunchback. He wasn't Quasimodo, he was a craftsman shaping gargoyles and saints from ancient stone, leaving fingerprints on the same walls Hugo walked. He carved alone, and he carved fast, one co-worker recalled. Hugo spent hours in the cathedral, noting faces and habits. And it's easy to see how this silent figure could leave an imprint. No official record confirms the link, but the overlap is hard to dismiss. Le Bossu may never have rung the bells, but his shadow lingers. In literature, in architecture, in the space where fiction leans on fact. Sometimes the real person fades while the story hardens into legend, and sometimes, as here, both remain carved in stone. What do you think about it? Number 8. Kitty Smith. Kitty Smith's story began with pain, not with a stage. She was 9 years old in Chicago when her dad, drunk and furious, forced her arms onto a hot stove. The burns were so deep that doctors cut them off. She later called it an accident, but court papers told another story. Her dad walked free. Kitty was sent to a children's home for the poor and disabled, where she refused to disappear. She taught herself to write letters, draw, type, and sew using only her feet. At 18, she printed her story and went door to door asking for 25 cents a copy. It added up to $35,000. She didn't join the sideshow until her 40s, performing with big traveling shows. She wasn't born unusual. She was made that way by cruelty, and instead of letting it end her, she turned it into a way to live. People stared at her feet. She built her life with them. Number 7. Emma Leach. Well, long before Barnum built his empire, a woman named Emma Leach became the first documented human curiosity exhibited in the United States. A dwarf, just 22 inches tall, she was displayed in Boston and featured in Ames's Almanac, where her portrait appeared beside political figures like John Dickinson and Catherine Macaulay. But only Emma's image came with a printed article, one that reduced her to height and anatomy, erasing voice, history, and personhood. The writer described her body in detail, then apologized that the account may not be so particular as the curious would desire, because Emma had refused an accurate examination. That refusal, small as it seemed, was resistance. In a world obsessed with access, she denied full exposure. She stayed partly unknowable, human in a system built to make her an object. Emma Leach never chose to be remembered as a spectacle, but even she is. Number 6. The Illusionist of Two Selves. Fred Vann, known on stage as Fred-a-Fred, claimed to be born in 1908, but his act never relied on birth dates. He was a half-and-half performer, presenting one side of his body as male, the other as female. He wasn't intersex. He was a precision artist, using clothing, posture, and confidence to split himself down the middle. The illusion worked. He claimed to appear in Freaks, though he's uncredited. Josephine Joseph played the lead, he/she, but Fred may have been among the background faces. In 1933, performing as Francis Farrell, he appeared at the Century of Progress World's Fair in Chicago, boasting he'd toured all 50 states and hit every major vaudeville circuit. When the stage dried up, he worked geek shows, biting the heads off chickens just to survive. But in the 1970s, long past the glamour, he dusted off the wig and returned to the Midway. Fred refused to vanish. Even when no one asked for him, he showed up anyway. Number 5. Celesta Geyer. Celesta Herman, also known as Geyer, grew up fast and big. By 6th grade, she weighed 150 pounds. By graduation, over 300. When her husband lost his job, she joined a carnival out of necessity, not fantasy. Under names like Dolly Dimples, Jolly Dolly, and the world's most beautiful fat lady, she filled tents across the country. At under 5 feet tall, she eventually reached 555 pounds and headlined Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey through the 1930s and 40s. A heart attack in 1950 almost ended her story. Instead, she rewrote it. "I decided I'd live, not just perform," she said. On a baby food diet, she lost 443 pounds in just over a year, shifting from spectacle to teacher. She published a diet book, toured as a lecturer, and became a symbol of hard-won change. She lived many more years, and in 2014 was inducted posthumously into Coney Island's Sideshow Hall of Fame, a survivor whose final act was her own transformation. Number 4. The Human Owl. Martin Lorello, born Martin Emmerling around 1886, could turn his head nearly all the way backwards. It wasn't a trick. It was his anatomy. He started in Europe and came to the United States in 1921, settling into Coney Island, where the crowds were thick and hungry for shock. They called him the Human Owl. He worked the same circuits as Ringling Brothers and Dick Best's Royal American shows, appearing alongside Popeye Perry and Junior Stiles, a boy known as Lobster Boy. His act left people unsettled. Watching a man's face rotate until it looked over his own shoulder was too close to a nightmare. He performed into the 1940s. Outside the tent, there's little record of him. No memoirs, no scandals. Just that silhouette. Back turned, eyes still watching. Lorello's skill blurred the line between marvel and discomfort. He never softened it. He just did it, night after night, until the crowd stopped coming and he faded from sight. Number 3. The Three-Legged Wonder. Frank Lentini didn't hide, or even he didn't try to fix anything. He was born in Sicily in 1889 and had 3 legs, 2 sets of genitals, and a body that shouldn't have worked. But he made it to work. He could walk, run, kick footballs, and even ride a bike, with all 3 legs. His 3rd leg came from a parasitic twin that never separated. But Frank didn't treat it like a problem. By 8, he was on stage in America, performing in front of packed tents. He danced, jumped rope, and turned every movement into a challenge. Audiences watched in shock. He performed for decades, earned citizenship, got married, raised kids, and bought a farm. His life wasn't perfect, but it wasn't freakish either. It was full. The difference never left him, but it never defined him the way outsiders assumed it would. He didn't lean into pity. He turned it all into control. Number 2. The Fat Lady of Coney Island. Now this one is just awesome. Amanda Siebert wasn't always called Jolly Irene. Born in 1880, she weighed a lean 120 pounds until giving birth at 21. Then everything changed. A sudden hormonal disorder caused her body to grow uncontrollably, eventually nearing 700 pounds. In a world that turned size into a ticketed attraction, Irene made the best of it. She joined the Ringling Brothers sideshow, performing under the name Jolly Irene, a blend of circus branding and, by most accounts, genuine spirit. When she became too large to fit in standard train cars, she limited her travel to Ringling's New York runs and settled in Coney Island. There, she became a presence. Audiences came expecting to gawk, but often stayed quiet, struck by her warmth and humor. Irene never chose her condition, but she did choose how to live inside it. She wasn't just a performer. She was a woman who carried herself like someone who didn't owe the world an explanation and never asked it for permission. Number 1. Julia Pastrana. Julia didn't walk into rooms quietly. Her presence hit first. Thick black hair covered her face and body, hypertrichosis, and people labeled her the Ape Woman. But she wasn't an oddity. She was brilliant. She danced, sang opera, and spoke 3 languages. People stared, but they didn't look away because she had control of the room. She married her manager, got pregnant, and died during childbirth. That should have been the end. It wasn't. Her husband had her and their baby mummified and toured them for decades. That wasn't tribute. It was exploitation. Julia spent more years dead in a glass case than she lived in her own skin. In 2013, her body was finally returned to Mexico and buried. A small ceremony, almost anonymous, but her story still hits. Julia wasn't a creature. She wasn't a freak. She was a woman with talent, dignity, and value. What they did to her was disgusting. What she left behind wasn't. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for hanging with us, and we'll see you soon.